My guest tonight is Colin Liddell. He is the editor of Alternative Right, and also he hosts the Alt Right podcast. Colin, how are you doing tonight?
Yeah, hello, Tim. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too, virtually, I guess, over the internet. Yeah, I'm talking to you all the way, I guess, from the other side of the world, so you're a day ahead of us here. But
Whereabouts are you located?
East Coast of the United States,
Uh,
so you're about 14 hours ahead of me.
I'm the east coast of Asia.
Oh, there you go. So through the wonders of the internet, we're talking to each other.
That's right, yes.
Listen, you had an article the other day that caught my eye. The National Rearview, Obituary of a Cuckservative Rag. Um, how much for a copy of Cuckgasm? Okay. So I thought you wrote a very insightful piece about the National Review, and I guess you in the piece you kind of talk about its origins and what it represents today, and
Mhm.
Bill Buckley and what he represented and what his magazine is today. You want to go into how do you want to get into this?
Well, yeah. I mean, I've only visited America briefly, so I don't have much knowledge on a practical day-to-day level of the National Review, and I only really became aware of it through the Woody Allen film Bananas, where there's a very funny skit at the beginning of the movie where Woody Allen goes into a magazine shop and he's looking for pornography, and he's sort of scanning the top shelf with all these various porn mags, and great gag. The National Review has been placed right there amongst all the smuts, and so that kind of intrigued me when I saw that as a kid. I thought, the National Review, that must be some really shocking magazine. And so that's how I first became aware of it. And then as I developed an interest in American politics, it started to, of course, crop up a lot, and especially the persona of William Buckley. And so that became a kind of a reference point for American politics. And I'm part of the alt right, the alternative right, and a lot of people in the alternative right, for them, the National Review is a kind of bugbear, and William F. Buckley is a kind of incarnation of evil, and so there's almost a kind of demonization process that goes on, and of course, I mean, a lot of that is perhaps justified because the National Review has been very very harsh in dealing with people it disagrees with, and in stifling debate and dissent. And of course, there's many famous examples of writers being fired and purged by the National Review. And I also wrote a very lengthy review of the issue of Radix 2, which is put out by the National Policy Institute, and they had an issue called Radix 2: The Great Purge, which was all about the American conservative movement. And so, I reviewed that for the Occidental Observer. So in reviewing that, I kind of focused a lot of my attitudes about the National Review and what it meant in American politics.
Now, you mentioned a lot of these writers that were purged. I guess my mind goes back to I think Murray Rothbard was one, a
Yeah.
libertarian. He was very critical of the Cold War agenda. Melvin Bradford,
Uh-huh.
Joseph Sobran.
Yeah.
More recently, that was in the 90s, as late as the 90s. Anyone who seemed to, I guess, wander off the reservation, the Cold War reservation that was, I guess, built right after World War II or the 50s. So anyone who, and Bill Buckley, I guess he's referred to it, there's a book called The Pied Piper of the Establishment
Yeah.
by McManus. I guess that he was a John Birch Society president, I think, who wrote that book. And
Yeah.
how he details how, Bill Buckley kind of like became the supreme pontiff of the establishment right. And
Yeah.
anyone who disagreed with him would immediately find himself unemployable or, kind of purged from the movement itself.
Yeah.
And for that, a lot of the, I guess, some of the more interesting writers of the old right. You said alternative right. I think alternative right. I think that's sort of a is that sort of like an outgrowth of maybe the paleo right in
Um,
America?
I don't. I wouldn't quite say that. No. I mean, there are. I think what's well. I mean, what the alternative right is actually a very large topic. So perhaps we shouldn't
Well, that's
really
another
uh,
definition. Yeah.
wander into that right now. But it includes quite a lot of strands. It's a kind of umbrella term at the
Hmm.
moment. But it's defined by a kind of rejection of egalitarianism and by a greater sense of identitarianism,
Hmm.
which are two things that have been kind of really, unjustly swept away by the political trends of the last, 5 or 6 decades.
The, yeah, you open up the piece. I'll quote you the piece is the National Review, which I will henceforth refer to as the more appropriate moniker, National Rearview, is like a forgotten great aunt who you assume to be dead until you hear one day that she's broken out of her care home and has been caught wandering around in her nightie attacking postmen. And of course, that would be because of their attack on Donald Trump recently, correct?
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're attacking the messenger, so that's sort of coded in there. But
And,
yeah. I mean, the National Review. I mean, I think people attack it in the wrong way sometimes. And when you attack things, you have to discriminate between the good facets and the bad facets. And looking at the National Review in context, I mean, a lot of people go back to the 1950s and the 1960s when people like the John Birch Society were being purged and so on. And a lot of the paleocons, uh, their their critique of the National Review is completely different from my critique of the National Review because the way I see it, and I kind of expressed this in my review of Radix 2, The Great Purge. What the National Review and what William Buckley were doing in the Cold War period was probably necessary. And so that part of their history, I mean, I don't like what they're doing, but there's a kind of rationale behind it, which is
mhm.
justified by the expediencies of the Cold War. Because America was the country that was least prepared to fight the Cold War by its cultural background. I mean, America was an individualist country. It had a kind of small government culture. It had a kind of small town mentality, like don't bother us and we won't bother you. And that's great in America. Traditional America, which was this very, very secure society, uh, completely safe behind two massive oceans, which the British Empire was able to, dominate. That America had no threats, there was no danger to that country. So you could develop this very kind of laissez-faire, small government, individualist attitude, and that is the kind of essence of America in a sense. But around about 1945, everything changed, of course, because you had effectively the collapse of the British Empire, and you had the rise of this very, very dangerous new totalitarian power of the Soviet Union, and it was suddenly a whole new ball game. And I think at that point, America really had to sort of turn on a dime in order to face up to this. And what the National Review was doing, and Buckley, they were actually working out a new kind of synthesis between left and right.
And I think it was Buckley who said that a conservative is someone who stands athwart history, yelling "Stop."
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's often quoted, and I think I'm not really sure why that one remark is given so much prominence because that's almost become like a shorthand for William F. Buckley. And I don't think he was really about that. I think he was part of a much more kind of Hegelian process
Hmm.
where you had this you had this kind of more totalitarian aspect of the state being synthesized with this more kind of quintessential American spirit of more freedoms, as I kind of expressed it in the article.
Hmm. Now, of course, Buckley's famous quote in Commonweal, 1952, I think encapsulates what you're saying here. He said, "Thus far, invincible aggressiveness of the Soviet Union imminently threatens U.S. security, and therefore we have got to accept big government for the duration, for neither an offensive nor defensive war can be waged, except through the instrumentality of a totalitarian bureaucracy within our shores." He then
Hmm.
concluded, "We must support large armies and air forces, atomic energy, central intelligence, war production boards, and attendant centralization of power in Washington, even with Truman at the reins of it all." So, kind of there you have it. This is Buckley's vision: a boot on your face forever, all in the name of national security. It's almost like America lost itself in both World Wars and the Cold War, and then
Yeah.
this Hegelian dialectic you mentioned, that you could see that both World Wars, World War One and World War Two, and then all of a sudden we have the Cold War, and there's Buckley. They're kind of justifying it all, and at the same
Yeah,
time,
that just
yeah,
really fits in perfectly.
yeah,
That one quote.
yeah,
I mean, they call it the Cold War for a reason. It was a kind of war. I mean, there was a definite struggle for mastery going on.
hmm
And in a war, you do have to, mobilize your nation. You have to do a lot of things that you wouldn't normally do in peacetime. And that's exactly the same pattern that we see. We see America kind of going against the grain of what it is, and really because it's kind of been thrown into that position. Without America fighting the Cold War, I mean, a lot of the course of history would have been quite different. A lot of things would have happened that would probably shock us now.
Now, of course, what you had, so basically the Cold War creates this dialectic in American politics.
Hmm.
And basically what it does is it creates this crisis system that I think the war planners, were thinking of even before the war ended in 1942, 44. They're talking about the existence of NATO, and at the same time they're aiding Stalin and his drive westward into the heart of Germany. And of course, the policy of unconditional surrender was going to inevitably lead to this situation.
Yeah.
If you destroy German power in Europe, Russia's going to fill the vacuum.
Yeah, it's almost like it's a bit like Iraq in a way, isn't
Hmm.
it? Yeah, it's like Iraq is a miniature version of what happened in Europe in 1945. You take out the central power, and then you create a vacuum, and then you get all these kind of horrible people that are sucked in by that vacuum,
Hmm.
and then you basically have to do some sort of shoddy deal with them to get by.
But after reading your piece, I ran across a piece by Paul Gottfried
Yeah.
talking about the National Review. It's kind of like a day later or something. And he wrote this thing. Where is this quote here? But he's questioning whether the National Review is even a genuinely conservative magazine. He says, "Why should we think, for example, that the National Review expresses conservatism when it
Hmm.
protests Vladimir Putin's critique of Western social decadence, and when a National Review regular contributor wishes to intervene in Ukraine on behalf of transgendered?"
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
obviously not conservative, and I don't
yeah.
think, in a real sense, it was never a conservative magazine. I think you can make a case for that. I mean, the underlying agenda is basically big statism, overseas adventurism,
Hmm.
and so some of the policies which seem baffling to people of a conservative viewpoint or a paleoconservative viewpoint. The National Review has always kind of pushed a certain kind of racial agenda of race equality and venerating Martin Luther King. And, it was a gradual process, obviously, but the direction was very consistent from what I've heard.
It was very establishment, just to say that. Very
Yeah,
establishment.
that kind of racial attitude makes sense in the context of the Cold War, because in the context of the Cold War, um, one of the most powerful tools of the communists that they could use to undermine Western power was the accusation of racism, because the Western powers were the established powers in the world, and
Hmm.
when you have some kind of global order, the certain countries are going to dominate it more than other countries, or certain races are going to dominate it more than other races for the various and
Hmm.
obvious reasons. And so with that was made very kind of explicit in the colonial system. You had countries like Britain and France lording it over the Africans and the Indians and the Vietnamese and whatever. Um, and so you could say that's a very blatant case of racial supremacy, and therefore you could attack that. But then even in the kind of post-colonial era, you still have a lot of neo-colonialism. I mean, America's relationship to South America, for example, that was essentially a kind of neo-colonialist arrangement. And after Africa decolonized, you still had countries like France and Britain playing a very kind of influential part in those countries' governments. So the idea of kind of anti-racism gave the communists in the Soviet Union and in Asia, the Chinese, it gave them a sort of stick with which to beat the West. And so to sort of counteract that, you have to show, look, no, we're not racist. We believe in the black man and the yellow man and the brown man as much as anybody. And so you get this kind of in America, that kind of feeds into the whole civil rights movement, because the civil rights movement, it had its own kind of drivers from some people in the black community, and of course a lot of people in the Jewish community who were pushing for that. But it also at a higher level, you had the kind of WASP establishment realizing that they had to go along with it.
And with the civil rights and American civil rights movement itself, with the so-called Black Jewish Alliance, and
Hmm.
because it was Jews that largely established NAACP,
Yeah.
but again
I think. What's that? There's that story about that black guy who wants to participate in the NAACP, and he goes along to the office and he goes in there and it's all Jewish people.
yeah. There was Marcus Garvey.
It was somebody else. Yeah. Anyway,
So,
one of the early kind of high yeller black men who wanted to get politically active.
but even with I think Martin Luther King's handler was a guy Levinson, who
Yeah.
they think ghostwrote a lot of his speeches and utterances and letters from a Birmingham jail. I think he wrote that for him. But
Yeah.
the goal there too was they were, I guess, exploiting a real grievance or fissure in American society. But some people think that was more of a radical agenda to kind of radicalize, turn the blacks into like what they call a lumpen proletariat or revolutionary.
Yeah, you say fissure in American society, but I mean, it's like I mean, the presence of blacks in American society was problematic, and it's even more problematic today. I mean, they haven't done anything to really solve that problem. They just made it worse.
Mhm.
I mean, basically, it's a scab, and if you pick out a scab, it will bleed, and that's what the last few decades have been.
Hmm.
In the 1950s, you had this nice big scab covering the problem, and in the 1960s they started the 1950s too. They started scratching that scab like hell, and
Hmm.
so and what you have now is this big scratched scab, and it's just bleeding.
And that, I mean, that goes deeper into the 19th century, of course, with
Mm,
the so-called Civil War and the
mm,
destruction of the South, the destruction of the military occupation of the South, and the corruption of Reconstruction
yeah,
that occurred. And you had that bitterness that the war created, and they kind of like forgot it for the better part of a century. Then along comes the 50s and 60s, and all of a sudden it becomes an issue that the federal government starts to take up.
uh-huh.
Yeah.
Are,
For
are
for
you are you a gentleman of the South?
Oh no, I'm not actually. I mean, technically I was born in the South, but that's real. That's Miami, Florida, but that's not really the South. I happen to be
Uh,
there, but really my family comes from Ohio.
uh-huh.
So, but I mean, I'm as far as if you were I'm sympathetic towards secession.
Yeah.
Say that.
Well, I tend to be a bit sympathetic to the South because of the it's heavily Scotch and Scotch Irish in origins.
And the South represents sort of still to this day represents a sense of like local patriotisms and
Mhm.
local pride. That's largely what's being attacked now with the the assaults on the psyops, these occasional psyops that spring up targeted at the Confederate flag.
Mhm.
And they're prefabricated. They're not genuine. It's absurd.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting the way that they waited until like last year to do all that.
Yeah, it's all
Uh,
time.
yeah, that's one of the interesting points about the Cold War because going back to the kind of the main the main point about the National Review and
Hmm.
William F. Buckley and this fake conservatism that he promoted as a tool to fight the Cold War. It's sort of interesting that on a certain level, there's the attempt to purge certain elements and to centralize everything, but also there's a kind of caution about tackling certain other areas. I mean, if you're trying to centralize and unify America, one of the main kind of cultural dividing points would be this old North-South conflict,
Hmm.
and with regards to promoting a kind of racial egalitarian version of Western ideology, they were very careful not to destabilize South Africa until it was, until the Cold War had effectively finished. So
Hmm.
you, it's actually quite. There's a lot of realpolitik involved with what went on. There's a lot of careful judgment about which battles to fight and which battles not to fight.
And you also have the causes of, let's say, integration and racial equality.
Hmm.
These ideas, while they may have some laudable motivations behind it, at least by some of the participants,
Yeah.
they also can be manipulated and weaponized by powers that be to achieve a dialectic or achieve something, some sort of ulterior motive. A good
Hmm.
example of that would be the destruction of the urban neighborhoods, the ethnic neighborhoods in the United States in the 40s and 50s, under urban renewal and racial integration. And the
Yeah.
idea wasn't so much to promote integration; it was to create white flight. And the end result is a society more segregated than ever.
Well, yeah, there
Now,
was. We had some articles by Alex Fontana on Alternative Right about that very thing. Let me just dig them up.
and a lot of this was to break up the Catholic neighborhoods, and this was sort of a WASP Jewish thing.
Yeah,
And
that was his thesis
yeah.
entirely. Yeah, we had. Let's see. Yeah, he did a couple of articles called "Man Spreading for Lebensraum,"
Hmm.
and it's really about exactly that very point about how they wanted to break up the kind of ethnic white neighborhoods, the kind of Italian or Irish neighborhoods, and they wanted to create a kind of de-ethnicized kind of suburban white. And they saw that as being easier to kind of control. And again, there was a lot of Jewish people behind this, but also a lot.
It was Hollywood too, right?
Yeah, but there was also a lot of the WASP elite too.
Yeah, like the foundations, the Rockefellers, the Ford Foundation, the
Mhm.
Quakers, and they through urban renewal they could just declare things blighted, you know, because they were just old or something, whatever, and they could just kick people off the property. At the same time, you had foundations that were funding. They called it blockbusting. They would
Mhm.
pay to have a black family buy into a neighborhood, and then pretty soon people will sell. And at the same
And
time,
it's very predictable, so you can always make money out of anything that can be predictable like that.
and of course the a lot of these they were migrating from the south, the sharecroppers. They go into the city, and they're set up, to be attacked by these angry mobs because their neighborhoods are being destroyed. And there was an example where the Quakers are the ones that brought Martin Luther King into Chicago in 1967, and he knew, or 66, I think it was. He knew nothing of what was going on in Chicago. He was from the South, and the problems of the South are very different from the problems of the North. It wasn't a racial thing; it was an ethnic thing. And even the black activists up there said, "What are you doing up here?" And even the Mayor Daley, said, "Just go back home. You don't know what you're dealing with." And pretty much the protesters were saying to these ethnic neighborhoods is, you need to leave because you're here. It's their neighborhood. It's like, but the goal there was to create strife, to create division. It wasn't there to create a racial kumbaya or peaceful integration. They knew full well that the dialectic would create violence, and the dialectic would expedite the diaspora into the suburbs, and then create sort of this bland white middle class, and that was part of the Cold War agenda too.
Yeah, you could see this in terms of kind of ethnic war, or you could see it as more economically driven. You know what I mean? Because if you're getting people, I mean, this is the big question. I mean, a lot of people feel comfortable having a villain in this story.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So, and there are some quite plausible villains to be had, and so people tend to focus on that. And I tend to think they do that a little bit too much, because it just our brains are wired that way. We're wired to look for somebody to blame for everything.
Yeah, we want a simple narrative.
Yeah. And I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, and a lot of these things happen because of certain economic processes, and of course, economic processes always operate through people's self-interest, and so in that respect, you have people who are making things happen. But that doesn't mean the people who are making things happen are actually in control. They are kind of moving towards the money, so to speak. So therefore, they're enslaved by the process as much as anybody else. And with urban renewal in America, you have a lot of economic gains, because once people feel unsafe in their neighborhoods and unsatisfied with where they live, then they're economically motivated to work hard, save up money, spend money on buying a house in the suburbs, which then has an enormous kind of, in mass, that has an enormous economic impact. It's a real economic driver. And so you get a lot of vested interests that are just going along with that, because that's where the money is.
And you have the Federal Housing Administration, which is offering up 30-year mortgages at low interest rates. And so, that itself that's not a market process. That's a government intervention into the market. That coupled with the construction of the interstate highway system, which is a huge subsidy to the automobile industry, who, by the way, was constructed under the auspices, of what's his name, the head of General Motors. The Secretary of Defense who oversaw that was the head of General Motors at one time.
Oh yeah.
And that would boost car sales.
Yeah, and a lot of this is also feeds into the change in economics and towards a new kind of sort of public-private kind of synthesis of capitalism, through Keynesian economics. And again, you can also relate that back into the idea of America becoming a more centrist and big state society in order to be able to, stand up to somebody like to a country like the Soviet Union. So a lot of these things have various aspects which coincide and align, and then when they align, that strengthens the traction in that particular direction.
And of course, during World War II, I think the federal government recapitalized U.S. industry from the amount of like $40 billion in 1941 dollars. And they moved a lot of the factories out of the cities, and this was done to break up the weaken the labor unions. At the same time, they're importing cheap labor from the South.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's specifically done for that reason, but I mean that's one of the benefits that accrue to certain people, and so therefore you can count on those people to push that. But I mean, war economies are always very, very interesting because I think they kind of highlight the underlying nature of economics,
Hmm.
and what economics is. I mean, like most people, they have a very kind of reductionist view of economics. They focus on this aspect or that aspect, and they have certain mathematical formulas which they like to apply to various bits and pieces. But I think most economists they actually talk around the real issue of how economics works, and economics is a very kind of emotional thing, I think, and it depends on making people feel certain kind of very raw emotions. And in a war economy, you have this kind of existential threat. You're at war with this country which wants to destroy you. They want to invade you, humiliate you, come in, rape your women, etc., etc. So you can stoke up all these emotions, and once you stoke up these emotions, then that drives economic activity. You can then I mean, in the case of the Soviet Union, because of World War II, and in that case, I guess you could say it was a very real existential threat. So their emotions were really engaged. They were able to move a large part of their industry hundreds of miles to the east to escape from the German armies. And people were putting in like 20-hour days, and dying of overwork and
Hmm.
things like that. And this is what you get when you a very comfortable, cozy society becomes a very economically stagnant society. And I think that's part of the problem that the West, the modern West, and developed countries have. Once you have enough economic development, then why should you continue to work at an unhealthy rate? And so people have a natural inclination just to slow down and take it easy and enjoy the fruits of their labor. But once that happens, the economy starts to go into reverse. And then we have this horrible credit-driven system, and so a credit-driven system relies on constant growth, and so people are not allowed to rest. You've got to when that happens, you've got to have something to scare them. You have to actually introduce dysfunction into the system to stimulate people's emotions, to make them desire something that they didn't previously need.
Yeah, you can see that actually in policy papers like NSC 68, and also, well, some say it was a spoof or a joke, but the report from Iron Mountain, the
Mm.
concerns for what would happen if peace were to come, how would you organize and coordinate society without a threat?
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know?
that's true. Yeah, there's
Yeah.
always a bit of after wars. There's always a bit of a post-war slump. I think, but that was the case with World War One and with World War Two to a certain extent. But I think they were a bit more ready, and then they introduced a lot of things like the Marshall Plan in Europe and so on.
And Korea came along and saved them, as Dean Acheson wrote.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
Code Warriors.
and,
That's
and that whole kind of that's one of the reasons why America bought into the so-called Cold War paranoia. I don't really think it was paranoia, but at the time, the way it was effected was through a kind of paranoia because America was pretty safe. I mean, they had nuclear weapons, they had two oceans, they had the only powerful navy.
hmm
So America didn't really have to get involved in the Cold War. They could have let Europe get by on its own, and maybe the Soviets would have taken over, and then maybe this would have happened and that would have happened. You know what I mean? But the Americans had the option just to sit it out.
hmm
But I think one of the reasons they didn't do that was because they wanted to get into it, and they wanted to mainline on that kind of fear and paranoia in order to help drive their own economy. Because otherwise, they would have been too cozy, and that would have led to an economic downturn.
Well, I think what happened at the end of the war, you had this notion of the American century, Henry Luce's term,
Mm.
but there was an idea that they at the end of World War II, the American establishment, which was closely linked to the British establishment, I think, the elite, economically at least, at the Eastern Seaboard, saw that America had kind of become the perennial, or to be the prime Anglo-American, the source of Anglo-American power had been, at least military, transferred to the United States at that point.
Yeah.
And this was an ongoing process going. I think this largely was the project of Cecil Rhodes going back to the end of the 19th century, is how to integrate the English-speaking peoples, as Winston Churchill called them, to dominate the planet. And right. I think that spelled out the 30 Years' War against Germany. It's the larger kind of geopolitical machinations that were going on.
So you're saying that they decided to take down Germany?
Yeah, Germany was same with Russia. Simultaneous, I think. This is Atlanticist versus the continental powers, the sea power versus land power. It's the Mackinder Doctrine, which was he was a British geostrategist in the early 20th century. I think he died in like 1945 or 46. But he shaped British policy. When Britain switched from being more concerned with Germany than with France at the turn of the 20th century.
Yeah.
And Germany became the enemy because Germany was a strong continental power, and Britain's always played that part of trying to destabilize the continent.
I think I don't think Britain really wanted to have a war with Germany, but they're kind of almost pushed into it by the way that Germany was behaving. And by that, I mean, I think the British tend to be kind of pragmatic about other rising powers, and they like to sort of smooth things over. I mean, you can see this with America. I mean, if Britain was concerned about British power, the one country they should have taken out would have been the United States. Mm-hmm. They should have intervened in the Civil War and helped the country to break up into smaller units that could then be controlled by British power. That would have obviously been the realpolitik thing to do.
Well, there was some discussion to that effect, but I think Gettysburg.
I think with the Germans, I mean, the Germans were a little bit in a hurry. They were a bit impatient. They were a bit, in Britain at that time. I guess the sort of main concept ruling behavior and etiquette was the idea of good form. And, good form, in a sense, it's very Aristotelian, very pragmatic. And also, it's actually quite a Confucianist idea, good form. But it means that, there's a correct way of doing things. Like, people will rise and fall, and countries will rise and fall. But it can be nicely managed through the idea of good form. It's kind of like a harmonizing concept. And I think Britain was prepared to kind of cut Germany a fair degree of slack. But the thing was, the Germans were much more impatient than that. They're much more in a hurry. And I think the key thing that really ruined it with the British was the Germans decided to have this massive fleet, and that was like a real dagger pointed at the throat of Britain, and so that kind of rubbed them up the wrong way, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And so if the Germans had just played it a little bit more subtly, with a bit more tact, I think World War I wouldn't have happened. Britain wouldn't have fought Germany. They would have, got on quite well. Their royal families were very, very closely connected, after all. Mm-hmm. I mean, so it was a terribly unnecessary war, and I think it's this. I think the Germans tend to have something in their nature which I guess you could characterize as a kind of try hard aspect, where they try a bit too hard with everything they do. And you can see that with Kaiser Wilhelm. You can see it with Adolf Hitler. I mean, Adolf Hitler, there was a rationale behind what Hitler was doing, and a lot of people in Britain actually kind of sympathised with Hitler, and they said, the Germans got a raw deal, and this guy, he's making some good points, and we should try to come to an arrangement with him. And now, of course, that's kind of demonised as appeasement. But there was a kind of rationale behind it. But Hitler, again, he kind of overstepped the mark. He went too fast, too soon. And so if he had been less German and more like Mussolini or somebody, then I think things would have went a lot more smoothly. And you see the same thing today with Angela Merkel. You have this kind of try-hard attitude to be, very tolerant and accepting of the other. And
It's kind of like the anti-Hitler, I guess.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's always it's like a consistent theme in German history. They have they have bad form, to put it in old-fashioned British
Yeah.
parlance.
Well, they've always the lack the subtlety and the I guess you could say the
Tone.
guile that the British had and how that's largely how the British got their empire
Yeah.
was through that. Um, but this like taking it back to Bill Buckley and National Review. Now, if you look at Bill Buckley's career, he was he worked for E. Howard Hunt. B. Buckley was a CIA guy.
Mhm.
Worked for E. Howard Hunt, who was sort of a kind of this black ops killer guy for the CIA, who later boasted of being involved in the JFK assassination, reportedly.
Mhm.
Um, but of course, Buckley was a graduate of Yale University and was a member of Skull and Bones. Then he
Yeah.
goes on to start National Review, um, and then he becomes a champion of the Cold War agenda. Some will look at that and be very skeptical of the National Review and its origins and its mission.
Mhm.
That's largely in the context of what's been exposed since the Cold War about the CIA and also the intelligence community's involvement in media, publication, and entertainment.
Mhm.
The cultural, I think, Stoner Saunders is her name, wrote the Cultural Cold War, and it
Yeah.
was the Congress for Cultural Freedom, where literally thousands of books, hundreds of magazines were published, or at least given funding by the CIA to
Yeah.
direct sort of the cultural Cold War. And as you said, this is sort of a response to what the Soviet Union was doing, what the cultural Marxists might have been doing, or what the communists were doing. But
Yeah.
nevertheless, what it does is this is something again where supposedly in the name of fighting your enemy, you're becoming your enemy.
Yeah.
You
Yes.
know, and other people have done research regarding some of the other some of the definitive political magazines of the era, like Ms. Magazine was most likely funded by the Central Intelligence Agency. In fact, Gloria Steinem has admitted she was indeed a CIA asset
Yeah.
during the Cold War, and part of that was to promote feminism in the same way this broad culture agenda to promote other things. Others have got into some of the sub projects of MK Ultra, like with Time Life, to promote the use of drugs in the
Yeah.
50s, sort of setting the stage for the 60s.
Yeah.
And so that suggests that again a lot of the what unfolded in the 60s wasn't quite as organic or as accidental as we've been taught.
Probably not. Yeah.
Yeah.
And my point is that in a weird way, all this nefarious activity was probably a good thing because the alternative was Soviet domination.
Hmm.
And so my main critique of the National Review is that when the West finally managed to quotation marks win the Cold War, they didn't then find a new purpose for the magazine. They kind of continued along that route,
Hmm.
even when it was no longer necessary.
Like NATO.
Yeah, like NATO, and then because they continue along that route, and because that breeds a certain reaction, then you end up having to actually need it again, because because NATO continued to exist after we won the Cold War, and it continued to kind of encroach upon Russia. Russia has now kind of reacted against that. So Russia has sort of built itself up, and it's becoming a more kind of assertive country, and it's taken over certain territories, in
Hmm.
fact. And so in a funny way, we're back to the position where we almost kind of need NATO again. I
And
mean,
there's a symbiotic relationship there, whereas you look at Russia and Putin, he's politically benefited from the existence of NATO.
yeah,
you
yeah. I
know,
mean, a much more softly approach would have worked better, I think. I think we've played that wrongly, and we've created a new enemy, and I don't think that's going to go away. And the EU is in some sort of disarray at the moment, so a lot could happen there.
and that's very good for the defense contractors, though, isn't it?
Oh yeah, there's always people who benefit. I'm not saying they pull all the strings, but they definitely think, oh, we've hit the jackpot this time.
Because all the countries going to NATO have to buy their armaments from somewhere.
Yeah,
So but there's a
but
something.
but also economically, there's a general economic benefit when paranoia rises and we have the fear of the other, and that's probably part of this kind of migrant crisis, because you have these very, very comfortable European countries. They all have lovely welfare states, and nobody really has to work hard. You can choose to be a bum and live in comfort,
Mhm.
and that's what they that's probably one of the differences between Europe and America. America, there's less welfareism, although that's obviously increasing a lot in recent years. So people can actually live in Europe very, very comfortably. Therefore, what's your motivation to work, really? I mean, or to work really hard? You get some cozy public sector job, or you're in some company where they can't fire you because of all these various layers of legislation passed by these social democratic governments. So but then if you introduce several million young male Muslim migrants who aren't getting laid, then you introduce a massive amount of fear and dysfunction, and then suddenly there's all these urgent tasks that have to be performed. You have to build refugee centers. You have to beef up security. You have to teach women how to behave again. And there's just this general paranoia. A lot of people will think I'm living in an area with too many migrants, so I have to work hard so I can move out of here.
Hmm.
Various things like that, and so that, in a way, you can see how the this alignment of unfocused economic interests could actually push governments to make ridiculously bad decisions like that.
And again, in much of that economic model that we've had, the sort of this debt-based Chai America model,
Hmm.
and Europe's, these welfare states, they really aren't sustainable in the long term because they're based on certain demographics, and the programs themselves tend to create demographics which make the system no longer sustainable because you're not creating the workforce, not having enough children to support retirees and pensioners. And that,
Yeah,
that and that creates pressure to import labor, which aggravates the cultural problem.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, that's that. I guess one of the main problems of the last 30 or 40 years is simply overproduction, and you have certain countries like Japan and China and Germany as well, which are very productive and they export a lot, and obviously they can't actually consume that themselves because it would mean them taking several hours off their day to go shopping.
Hmm.
Um, and in a country like Japan, Japan's a kind of classic example of this export-driven economy, this overproductive export-driven economy. The Japanese, they work like the blazes, and they live in very small houses. They don't have room to amass a lot of consumer goods. And so that's where a country like America comes in very, very useful. You have this large country with most people living in spacious suburban houses. They can drive to the shopping mall. So it's sort of set up to overconsume because certain other parts of the world are overproducing, and this has been the kind of rather sick symbiosis that's been going on for the last 30 years. And we've coined this term Chimerica to describe it. And China is like Japan, but on a bigger scale. So you have all these very, very hard working Chinese who have quite shitty lives, and they're just working hard so that China can buy more American debt. And that obviously doesn't go on forever because eventually China, through owning American debt, starts to own America.
Hmm. But that's that model. Of course, you also have the construction of the imposition. This has happened of the petrodollar.
Yeah.
In the 70s, that was of course, the aftermath of Nixon closing the gold window, closing down Bretton Woods. But that itself created a huge, pool of credit for the Treasury Department, and you have this deal with the Saudis, right, where
Yeah.
they buy debt and buy armaments from us.
Yeah, and
with the
it sort
dollar.
of put America in this very unique position of being able to create any amount of money it wants without suffering the direct consequences of that.
But what are the moral consequences of that?
The
I mean,
moral
yeah,
consequence. Yeah.
in America, because you've had this creates the macroeconomic trends which lead to the deindustrialization of the United States.
Yeah.
We're no longer producing things of value. It's all
Yeah.
financialization and
The
service industry.
moral consequences are you create this giant weak parasite that
Hmm.
will eventually be killed.
The question is that intentional?
I don't think it. I mean, I know a lot of people want to go into conspiracy theories and blame this group or that group, but I don't think it is actually. I think everybody signs off on this. Everybody who goes shopping signs off on this. Everybody who has two or three cars signs off on this. I mean, people. It appeals to certain inherent qualities that everybody has
Hmm.
to work less or and spend more, consume more. That's how we're wired, unfortunately. And to sort of deal with that, we have to counter that in some ways, and we have to counter that by instilling our own morality. But our capacity to do that has become kind of eroded more and more. So, we need something that can really stand up to these tendencies that we have, which are actually fueling these kind of very dysgenic and self-destructive trends.
Hmm. And
I mean, if we go into kind of paranoid mode and we say, okay, let's blame the Jews, and we become intensely anti-Semitic and hate-filled, that might even serve a very functional purpose because that's the way humans channel this kind of uh, internal moralization that they need. They need a devil in order to have a morality, and so if that serves a useful function, then I'm almost ambivalent about it in certain ways. I mean, I can see how stupid it is, but certain stupid things sometimes have a clever outcome.
hmm Well, because when you talk about sort of this nihilistic consumerism that has seemed to have overtaken America in the past few decades, this was largely a function of the creation of suburbia and the consumerism that it engendered with the car and the time. And then you also saw this lifestyle being sold in the media with through the Time Life enterprise, through
Yeah, and you're also
life. Yeah.
breaking down communities, and so people don't express their humanity through their communities, and so they're left with a void, and so they fill that by consuming more, and this change from these kind of rooted urban communities where you have where everybody kind of knows each other and you can walk down the streets and say hello to a lot of people, and then suburbia where you have people are more isolated and uprooted,
Hmm.
and that pushes people towards finding fulfillment through consumerism.
And also with the invention of these various gadgets, like I mean, obviously we're talking on the internet right now,
Yeah,
and it can have technology can have a very useful purpose. I can talk to a gentleman in Tokyo about these things, and it's
yeah,
great. But at the same time, there's a lot of this stuff, whether it's social media or through smartphones and computers, is people are being sucked into this own little virtual world and becoming atomized and isolated into themselves, and they're no longer communicating with people face to face.
yeah, and all that can be monetized. Every interaction on social media is monetized in some way or other. You know,
I noticed that with games with kids,
mm,
everything like the little electronic, like race cars,
yeah,
those little you have to have an app on your smartphone to use it,
yeah,
as opposed to just having a little device to. So already, in order for your kid to play with this toy, he has to start using a smartphone.
mm. Yeah, and there's all this kind of micro marketing. I mean, everything you do on social media is
Yeah,
monitored. They build up a virtual you.
there's some data mining going on.
Yeah, they're data mining
Yeah.
everything, and with all this data mining, they're building up. They're actually building up virtual versions of you that exist,
Hmm.
and these virtual versions of you are actually traded between various companies in various ways. And this information is used. So, for example, when you join some kind of social network, they kind of know who you are, and then they start kind of micro advertising to you because they know what kind of person you are. They can predict more or less with a certain degree of accuracy. It depends on the person, obviously, what kind of things you might or might not be interested in, and they start doing that. So Facebook does that. I guess Twitter probably does that in some way now. And it's become pervasive. Everything, unless it can be monetized and marketized by somebody, the system tends to have a vested interest in breaking it down. Like people going to the park and meeting each other, that doesn't make money for anybody. So the system has a vested interest in that park becoming slightly dangerous.
Yeah, yeah. Are you familiar with Catherine Austin Fitz?
No, I'm not. Who is she?
She runs Solari.com. It's a financial virtual newsletter.
Uh-huh.
Well, she was a former HUD assistant director, and she uncovered, at the time was like 40-50 billion dollars of fraud at HUD.
Uh-huh.
And she tried to be a whistleblower, and she was chased out of Washington. And then she went on to start like she was a financial advisor with her own little fund or something. And she claims that they tried to shut her down. They went after her legally and almost ran her out of the business.
Mm.
But she has this thing called the Popsicle Index.
Wow.
And it's based on the what level you're secure that your kid can go down to the corner store and buy a popsicle and come back and not get kidnapped or hurt.
Uh-huh.
And that's how she rates the stability or of a community, the safety of the community, the health of the community. But she was giving a talk, and she was talking about she has this article called "Narco Dollars for Beginners," and it's about how integrated narcotics trafficking, the money laundering, is in the economy,
mm-hmm.
and how it's laundered through Wall Street and through corporations, and how people that don't know it, but through their 401ks are heavily invested in narcotics trafficking. But what she gives an example is that she travels around the country and she'll stay at like chain hotels, and these hotels just don't have the capacity to justify their existence, and don't have they're not doing the business to justify their existence.
Yeah.
Same with restaurants. And what she says is what's happening is these businesses are being used to launder drug money.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens is these are all publicly traded companies.
Yeah.
Okay, which people's 401ks are invested in. And let's say if you are a drug dealer and you're making $100,000 a year selling methamphetamine or crystal meth, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And you have a certain amount of dealers, and what do you do with that cash? You can't just put it in a bank. But you go to a local KFC or a Burger King or a Howard Johnson or a hotel, and you run it through that business.
Mm-hmm.
And the business itself, that cash flow makes that corporation that much more profitable. That much also that corporation can.
You invest money in a business which is failing a bit.
Yeah.
You lose a bit of money, but you can also get your money out. So you take a bit of a loss.
Yes, laundering, like laundering.
Yes, to basically clean up